Here are 4 things that were said out loud in front of a man this year. A hospital board member said the word settlement and a number with 6 figures in it. 2 surgical residents said which attending was sleeping with which scrub tech. A woman in a very good coat said, into her phone, that her mother would be dead by Christmas and that she had already found a buyer for the house. And an orthopedic surgeon said, laughing, that a 9-year-old boy needed to learn that a hand does not go up in a grown man's house. All 4 of those things were said within 6 feet of Scott Rawlings, who was standing right there. And none of the 4 people saw a reason to lower their voice, because Scott Rawlings was holding a gray plastic bus tub full of dirty plates. I'm Nathan, and I want to start with that, because most stories about power are about who has it. This one is about a much stranger thing, which is who gets. Scene. There is a category of person that a certain kind of successful adult stops registering as a person at all. The guy wiping the table, the woman restocking the cups, the man in the back with the sprayer and the steam and the rubber apron. They become furniture. And the thing about furniture is that people say absolutely everything in front of it. For 9 years, one man in one building was furniture to almost everybody who walked through it. He was also, it turns out, the single most connected human being in that county, and not one of the people who ignored him had any idea. Stay with the fact that nobody looked at him. It is the entire mechanism of this story, and it is the reason a man with a medical degree, a lake house, and a hospital board seat lost everything in about 9 days. Idlewood is a town of 11,000 people in the flat part of the state, built around a bend in a river that used to carry barges and now carries kayaks in the summer. It has 1 hospital. Idlewood Regional has 140 beds, an emergency department that sees about 100 people a day, and a cafeteria in the basement that is the actual, honest-to-God center of that town, because it is the only place within 9 miles that is open and serving hot food at 4 o'clock in the morning. That is not an exaggeration. It is a fact with consequences. If you work nights in Idlewood, a nurse, a cop, an EMT, a lineman, a state trooper on the interstate, a respiratory tech, a security guard, a dispatcher, a lab courier, a funeral home driver, a snowplow operator in February, you eat in that basement. Not sometimes. Every single shift, for years, for decades. Scott Rawlings ran the dish pit down there on nights from 10 p.m. to 6:30 a.m. and had for 9 years. Here is how he got there, because it matters. Scott was 39. He had taught 8th grade earth science at Idlewood Middle for 6 years, and he had been good at it. He had a wife named Anna and a son named Parker, and a small house on Ridge Street with a garage he had converted into a workshop. Then, over about 14 months, 3 things happened in a row. His father died and left a debt nobody knew about. The district cut 2 science positions, and Scott was the second least senior. And Anna, who had been unhappy in a way she did not have words for yet, met a man at a charity gala for the hospital foundation, where she was working the registration table for $11 an hour. The man's name was Dr. Alexander Pendleton. The divorce took 9 months and it took everything. Not because Anna was cruel about it, she wasn't, not then, but because there was nothing to divide except debt, and Scott took most of it, because that is who he is. He signed papers in a lawyer's office in a shirt he had ironed himself and walked out owning a truck with 190,000 miles on it and half of his son. And here is the decision that everybody in his life told him was a mistake. Scott needed a job with health insurance and a schedule that let him have Parker every single afternoon. Not every other weekend, every afternoon. He wanted to be the one who picked the boy up at 3:15 and made him a sandwich and sat with him while he did his homework and drove him to practice and put him to bed. He wanted the ordinary hours, the boring ones, the ones nobody writes songs about, because he had watched his own father work days and swing shift, and had seen him maybe 40 evenings in his whole childhood. So he took the overnight dish pit at Idlewood Regional, 10 to 6:30, full benefits after 90 days, $19 an hour, which is not nothing. He slept from 7:30 in the morning until 2:40 in the afternoon, got up, and was in the pickup line at the middle school at 3:10 with the engine running. His mother, Sandra, cried about it. His friends said he was throwing away a degree. A guidance counselor he used to eat lunch with told him, kindly, that he was better than that. Scott Rawlings did it for 9 years and never once said a word against it, and if you had asked him, he would have told you the truth, which was that the job was the price of the afternoons, and the afternoons were not for sale. Now understand what 9 years in that particular basement actually builds. The night kitchen at Idlewood Regional was run by a 63-year-old man named Larry Oakhurst, who had been there since Carter was president, and Larry taught Scott the one thing that mattered, which was this. At 3 in the morning, everybody in this building is having the worst night of somebody's life, and you are the only person down here who can hand them something warm. So Scott started keeping plates. If the peds ED had a bad one, a drowning, a car seat that wasn't buckled, a kid who didn't make it, the nurses came down at 4 and there was food, because Scott had heard the helicopter and had gotten ahead of it. If a trooper came in soaked and shaking after a wreck on the interstate, there was coffee that wasn't burnt. If a family had been in the surgical waiting room for 11 hours, Scott sent up a tray and never charged for it, and never told anybody he'd done it. He learned names, all of them. He learned that Catherine Wolcott, the night charge nurse in the pediatric emergency department, took her coffee black with 1 sugar and could not eat before 3 a.m. or she'd be sick. He learned that a dispatcher named Ruth had a diabetic son. He learned which of the residents were vegetarian, which of the security guards was in recovery and needed a non-alcoholic option at the Christmas thing, and which respiratory therapist was quietly getting divorced and had stopped eating. 9 years. 300 nights a year, somewhere north of 2,700 shifts. There is not a nurse, cop, medic, tech, clerk, chaplain, or janitor who worked nights in Idlewood County in that decade, who did not know Scott Rawlings by name and did not owe him a small kindness they had never paid back. And there is not one physician on the day side who could have picked him out of a lineup. That is not a metaphor. It was measured, later, in a way nobody expected. Dr. Alexander Pendleton was 47, and he was, by every objective measure, extremely good at his job. He was a fellowship-trained orthopedic hand surgeon, a partner in Pendleton Nolte Orthopedic Group, which had offices in 3 counties, and he sat on the board of Idlewood Regional, where he had personally funded the renovation of the pediatric waiting room. There is a plaque. His name is on it in brushed steel. He was charming in the specific way that surgeons are charming, which is that he made you feel like the most competent person he'd met that day, right up until he needed something. He drove a car that people in Idlewood turned to look at. He had a lake house 90 minutes north. He coached his stepson's travel baseball team for 1 season and quit when the boy did not make the top roster, which he said, at a barbecue, in front of 11 people, was a lesson in reality. He married Anna Rawlings 14 months after her divorce and moved her and Parker into a 5-bedroom house on a private road. And for about a year and a half, everybody who knew Anna said that she had landed on her feet and that she deserved it. Scott never said one word about him. Not to Parker, not to his mother, not to Larry in the kitchen at 4 in the morning. He had made a rule the day the papers were signed. Whatever that house is, the boy has to live in it, and a boy cannot live in a house his father runs down. So he kept his mouth shut for 2 years. He did notice things. He is not stupid. He noticed that Parker got quiet on Sunday afternoons about 90 minutes before the handoff. He noticed the kids started narrating. We had a really good time, we watched a movie, everything was fine, before anybody asked. He noticed that Parker, who had been a hugger his whole life, stopped hugging people from the front. And in April, he noticed that his son flinched when Scott reached past him for the cereal. He asked, carefully, the way you have to. And Parker said everything was fine, because that is what 9-year-olds say. And Scott, who had taught 8th grade for 6 years and knew exactly what a kid protecting somebody sounds like, did the hardest thing in this entire story, which was wait, and watch, and write down dates in the back of a spiral notebook he kept in the truck, and not blow up the one arrangement that let him see his son every day. He waited 5 months. The Sunday in September that this story actually starts, Anna's car pulled into the driveway on Ridge Street at 4:15 in the afternoon, 20 minutes early, and Parker got out of the back seat with a fiberglass cast on his left forearm, from just below the elbow to the base of his thumb, in green, with nothing written on it. Anna did not get out of the car. She rolled the window down and said, in a bright voice pitched for the neighbors, that he'd taken a spill off the trampoline on Friday, and that they'd had it looked at, and that the discharge papers were in his backpack, and that she was sorry, she was running late for something. Then she drove away, and Scott Rawlings stood in his own driveway holding a grocery bag looking at his son. He did not ask about it on the porch. He made grilled cheese, because that is what they have on Sundays, and he cut it diagonally, because Parker has opinions. And he waited until the boy had eaten and they were sitting on the back steps in the last of the light. Then he said, "Tell me about the trampoline." And Parker Rawlings, 9 years old, looked at the yard instead of his father and said, "I fell, Dad. I promise I fell." I want to stop on that sentence, because there are 2 words in it that do not belong. I promise. A kid who falls off a trampoline says, "I fell off the trampoline," and then, usually, tells you how funny it was or how much it hurt, and gives you 11 details you did not ask for, most of them irrelevant, because that is what true stories do. They come with junk attached. I promise is not a detail. It is a load-bearing word. It is what somebody says when they have been given a sentence to deliver, and they need you to accept it and stop. Scott did not push. He said okay. He said it must have hurt. He asked if it hurt now. He got the cast signed with a dinosaur, because Parker wanted a dinosaur. And at 9:40 that night he stood in the parking lot of Idlewood Regional in his kitchen whites with the discharge paperwork from the boy's backpack in his hand, under a sodium light, reading it for the 4th time. The paperwork was from an urgent care in Delmar, which is 31 miles away, in the next county. There are 2 urgent cares in Idlewood. There is an emergency department 9 minutes from the Pendleton house, with a pediatric wing that Dr. Alexander Pendleton personally paid to renovate. They drove 31 miles. The diagnosis was a non-displaced distal radius fracture. The mechanism of injury, as reported, was a fall from a trampoline. Under splint applied by, someone had written a name, and then, in a different pen, in a hand Scott did not recognize, someone had added, "Reduction performed on scene by PT's stepfather, orthopedic surgeon." Scott read that line about 9 times. Then he read the date. The injury occurred on Friday evening. The urgent care visit was Saturday at 11:40 in the morning, 18 hours. An orthopedic hand surgeon, a man whose entire professional life is the 27 bones between a person's elbow and his fingertips, had a 9-year-old with a broken forearm in his house on a Friday night, and said it himself, and waited 18 hours, and then drove past his own hospital and 2 urgent cares and out of the county to have a physician assistant who had never met the family write it down. Scott Rawlings made a phone call at 9:50 that night, standing in that parking lot, before his shift started. He called the house on the private road, and Anna did not answer, and Dr. Alexander Pendleton did. The conversation lasted 2 minutes and 11 seconds. Scott would later be asked to recount it under oath, and he did, flatly, without embellishment, and the transcript is short enough to quote almost in full. Scott said he'd read the discharge papers and he had a question about the timeline. Pendleton said, pleasantly, that it was a clean, non-displaced fracture, that he'd stabilized it, that the boy was fine, and that he understood Scott would be worried, but that this was frankly one of the more boring injuries in pediatric orthopedics. Scott asked why they had driven 31 miles. There was a pause. Then Pendleton said, and this is the part Detective Amy Underwood eventually read aloud in a room with a 2-way mirror, that he was going to be straight with him, man to man, because he thought Scott deserved that. He said the boy had raised a hand to his mother on Friday night. He said, and I am quoting, "So what? I taught him a lesson. Kids need to learn there are consequences in a grown man's house." Scott said nothing. And Pendleton, reading the silence as what he had always read it as, which is a man who has understood his place, laughed, and said the sentence that ended his entire life. He said, "What's a dishwasher gonna do about it?" Scott Rawlings said, "Okay." He said, "Thank you for telling me," and he hung up. Then he stood in that parking lot for 4 minutes. Larry Oakhurst, coming in for the same shift, saw him standing there, and said later that he thought Scott had gotten bad news about his mother. Then Scott went inside, clocked in at 9:58, put on his apron, and washed dishes for 8.5 hours, because there is a thing about a man who has decided something, which is that he becomes extremely calm. At 4:10 in the morning, on his break, he made one phone call. He did not call the police, he did not call a lawyer, he did not call his mother, or his brother-in-law, or a guy he knew, or anybody who owed him money. He walked up one flight of stairs, went through the double doors of the pediatric emergency department, and asked the unit clerk if Catherine was on. Catherine Wolcott had been the night charge nurse in that department for 19 years. She was 55. She had 4 grown kids and a bad knee, and a laugh you could hear from the elevator. Scott had made her coffee, black, 1 sugar, at some point on essentially every shift they had ever shared, which was a number in the high hundreds. In 2019, her husband had a stroke in the parking garage, and Scott was the one who found him. She came out to the desk wiping her hands, and saw Scott's face and stopped walking. He put the discharge paperwork on the counter and said 7 words. He said, "I need you to look at this." That is the phone call. That is the whole thing. A man in a wet apron and a 55-year-old charge nurse standing at a desk at 4 in the morning under fluorescent lights and a piece of paper between them. Now here is what people misunderstand about this story, and it's the part I find genuinely beautiful. Scott Rawlings did not have power. He had no money, no title, no leverage, and no plan more sophisticated than, show this to somebody who will know what it means. What he had was access to the right eyes. Catherine Wolcott read that discharge summary standing up, and she got to the line about the reduction performed on scene by the stepfather, and she put her hand flat on the counter, which is a thing Scott had seen her do exactly twice before, both times on nights that ended badly. She said, "Who set this?" Scott said the name. And Catherine Wolcott, who had been a mandated reporter for 31 years, who had made this call maybe 40 times in her career, who knew precisely which extension to dial and precisely what words to use so that it could not be walked back in the morning, said, "Okay, honey, go finish your shift. Don't call anybody else. Don't go over there. Do not text her. Let me do this." Then she did 4 things in 11 minutes, and those 4 things are the entire second half of this story. I want to walk you through them slowly, because this is the most important thing anybody in this story does, and almost nobody watching will have ever heard of 3 of the 4. First, she made a mandated report, not to the police, to the State Child Protection Hotline, at 4:19 a.m., with a reference number, which she wrote on a sticky note and put in her pocket. That timestamp becomes very important later, because it exists in a system nobody in the Pendleton house had any influence over, and it exists before anyone in that house knew anything was happening. Second, she paged the on-call. Child abuse pediatrician. Well, most people do not know this job exists. Child abuse pediatrics is a board-certified subspecialty, real fellowship, real boards, and there was exactly one of them within 70 miles, a woman named Dr. Cynthia Talbert, who worked out of the Regional Children's Hospital and covered 5 counties on call. Her entire professional existence is telling the difference between an injury a child got and an injury a child was given. Third, and this is the one that mattered most, Catherine Wolcott requested a records aggregation. Here is the problem she had already identified in about 90 seconds, standing at that desk. Idlewood Regional runs one electronic record system. The urgent care in Delmar runs a different one. Pendleton Nolte Orthopedic Group runs a third. The Children's Hospital runs a fourth. A child can be seen at all 4 of those places over 2 years, and every single provider will see one injury and think, kids fall. Nobody stitches it together. There is no machine that does it automatically. Somebody has to. Ask. Catherine asked. At 4:31 in the morning, she filled out a request under the Health Information Exchange for every imaging study and encounter record on one 9-year-old patient across every participating facility in the state, going back to birth, and she flagged it urgent, and she attached the hotline reference number, which is the thing that makes it move in hours instead of weeks. Fourth, at 4:44 a.m., she called the house supervisor and said the sentence that starts the machine, "I have a suspected non-accidental trauma with a named perpetrator who holds privileges in this building." At 6:30, Scott Rawlings clocked out, drove home, and slept for 4 hours because he had a boy to pick up at 3:10. At 6:40, Dr. Cynthia Talbert was reading a discharge summary in her kitchen in her bathrobe. By 10 in the morning, a pediatric radiologist named Dr. Benjamin Sedley was looking at 4 X-rays on a screen, and one of them was from the urgent care in Delmar, and 3 of them were not. The record's aggregation came back at 9:52 a.m., and it was 11 pages long. Over the previous 26 months, Parker Rawlings had been seen for injury at 4 different facilities in 3 counties. November, 2 years earlier, a buckle fracture of the left wrist, urgent care in Marion, mechanism reported as fell off bike. The following June, a spiral fracture of the left fifth metacarpal, seen at an orthopedic office. Pendleton Nolte, in fact, at the satellite in Delmar, treated by a partner, mechanism reported as closed his hand in a door. The following March, a non-displaced rib fracture, incidental finding on a chest film ordered for a cough at a walk-in clinic. Mechanism, not reported. Nobody asked. And now, distal radius, September, urgent care in Delmar, reduced on scene by the stepfather. 4 injuries, 4 different buildings, 4 different charts. Not one of those providers had ever seen the other 3, and every single one of them had written down a story that a parent told them and moved on to the next patient, because that is what a 14-minute appointment does to a human being. Dr. Sedley then ordered the thing that ends all of this, which is a skeletal survey. A standardized set of about 21 X-rays that photographs every bone in a child's body. It is the single most boring and most devastating test in pediatric medicine, and it exists for exactly one reason, which is that bones keep a record even when the child does not. Parker Rawlings had that survey on a Tuesday afternoon with his father sitting in the room and his father's hand on his ankle. It found 3 healed fractures nobody had ever documented, 2 posterior rib fractures, left side, at different stages of healing, which is significant because posterior rib fractures in a school-aged child essentially do not happen from falls. They happen from compression, from being squeezed or gripped hard around the chest. And a healed fracture of the left ulna, angulated, remodeled, at least a year old, that had never been set by anybody, which means it had healed on its own, in a house, without a doctor. The spiral fracture of the fifth metacarpal in a 9-year-old is the one that made Dr. Talbert's report read the way it does. A spiral fracture in a small bone like that comes from a twisting force. Doors do not twist, hands do. Dr. Cynthia Talbert's opinion, filed 8 days after a man in an apron put a piece of paper on a counter, ran to 14 pages, and its operative sentence was 1 paragraph long. The pattern, distribution, and differing ages of these injuries are not consistent with the mechanisms reported. The reported mechanisms are inconsistent with each other and, in 2 instances, biomechanically implausible. In my opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, this child has sustained repeated non-accidental trauma over a period of at least 22 months. Now, the 6 a.m. phone call. Dr. Alexander Pendleton found out that something was happening at 5:38 on a Wednesday morning. And the way he found out is the single most satisfying thing in this file, because nobody arranged it. It was just the machine working the way the machine works. At 5:38 a.m., he received an automated notification from Idlewood Regional's medical staff office. It was 3 sentences long. It informed him that his clinical privileges at that facility had been summarily suspended. Pending review, that his access badge had been deactivated, and that he was to contact the chief of staff. Summary suspension is a real thing, and it is brutal by design. A hospital does not need to prove anything to do it. It needs a credible allegation and a reasonable belief that patients could be at risk, and then the burden flips. The physician has to go to a committee and argue his way back in. Here is the part Pendleton had not thought about in 20 years of sitting on that board. A summary suspension of more than 30 days is a reportable event. It goes to the National Practitioner Data Bank. It goes to the State Medical Board. Every hospital he holds privileges at, every insurance panel he bills, every malpractice carrier he pays, all of them get told. He had built his entire life on a structure, and the structure had a switch in it, and somebody had finally flipped it. He called his practice partner, Dr. Jerry Nolte, at 5:44. Nolte had received his own call 20 minutes earlier, because the aggregation had surfaced the June metacarpal treated at the Delmar satellite, and Nolte's name was on that chart. And Nolte, who is not a bad man, who is in fact the person in this story I feel worst for, had spent the last 20 minutes sitting on the edge of his bed with his head in his hands, realizing what he had signed his name to 14 months earlier, without asking a single follow-up question. Nolte did not offer support. Nolte said one sentence and hung up, and the sentence was, "Don't call me again." And at 6:02 in the morning, Alexander Pendleton called Scott Rawlings. Scott was awake. He had been awake since 5:30 because he had a boy in a green cast asleep down the hall in his old room, because Parker had been placed with his father under an emergency safety plan the previous afternoon. He let it ring twice. Then he answered, and he did not say hello. Pendleton's voice. On that recording. And yes, there is a recording, because Detective Amy Underwood had asked Scott the day before to please turn on call recording, which is legal in that state, with one-party consent. Pendleton's voice does not sound like a surgeon. He said, "Who are you? Who did you call? You can't do this to." And then he stopped, because he had run out of the front half of that sentence and could not find the back half, because he genuinely did not know what to accuse Scott of. That is the thing. There was no conspiracy to accuse him of. Scott had not called a lawyer, or a reporter, or a cop, or a friend on the board. Scott had shown a piece of paper to a nurse. Pendleton spent the next 6 minutes cycling through 4 positions, which is a thing people do when the ground is gone. He was angry. Then he was reasonable. This was a misunderstanding. There had been a rush to judgment. Scott of all people should understand how these things get twisted. Then he was insulting. He said Scott was a bitter man who had never gotten over his wife trading up, and that this was going to destroy Parker, and that Scott was doing this to a 9-year-old out of spite. And then, at the 6-minute mark, he was something else. He said, very quietly, "Please, I'll do anything. Just stop this." Scott Rawlings, who had washed 9 years of other people's plates so he could be in a pickup line at 3:10, listened to all 6 minutes of it without interrupting once. Then he said the only thing he said on that entire call, and it was 11 words. He said, "I didn't do anything, Alec. I just showed it to somebody." Then he hung up, and he made pancakes, because it was a Wednesday and Parker had school. I want to be very careful here, because the temptation in a story like this is to make the mother a monster, and the truth is more uncomfortable and more useful than that. Anna Pendleton was interviewed for 4 hours and 11 minutes on a Thursday, and she did not, at first, tell the truth. She said what she had said for 2 years, which is that Parker was clumsy, and that he was going through something because of the divorce, and that her husband was strict, but that strict is not the same as cruel, and that Scott was jealous. She held that line for 2 hours and 40 minutes. What broke it was not a threat and not evidence. It was Detective Amy Underwood, who is 34 and has a 5-year-old, sliding one page across the table and asking her to read one line out loud. The page was the March walk-in clinic note, the rib fracture found by accident on a chest film ordered for a cough, and the line was the mechanism of injury field, and the mechanism of injury field said, "Unknown, mother declines to speculate." Underwood asked her, "Why did you decline?" And Anna Pendleton, who had been a receptionist at a hospital foundation, making $11 an hour 4 years earlier, and who now had a 5-bedroom house on a private road and a husband whose name was on a plaque, put both hands flat on the table and started to cry, and said, "Because I already knew." The rest of that interview is the transcript that got her a suspended sentence instead of a cell, and it is not a nice document. She described the escalation the way people inside it always do, as a series of individually explainable moments. The first time was a grab by the wrist that left marks, and an apology that lasted a week, and a trip to Chicago. The second time was discipline, and she agreed, at the time, that Parker had been mouthy. The third time, she took him to Marion instead of Idlewood, because she did not want to run into anybody. By the fourth time, she was the one choosing which county to drive to. And the reason she never left, which she said in a flat voice at the 3-hour mark, is that she had told everyone she knew that she had gotten out of a hard marriage and into a good one, and she could not face being wrong out loud, in a town of 11,000 people, in front of a woman at church who had said something to her at the wedding. That is what it cost. A boy's forearm. Twice. because a woman could not stand to be seen having made a mistake. Alexander Pendleton was arrested on a Friday afternoon, 11 days after a dish pit worker walked up one flight of stairs. He was not arrested at his house or in a parking lot. He was arrested in the lobby of Pendleton Nolte Orthopedic Group at 4:40 in the afternoon, with a full waiting room, because Detective Underwood had asked the prosecutor whether there was any reason to do it privately, and the answer had been no. He was charged with 4 counts, including 2 felonies. He surrendered his passport. He was released on bond with a no-contact order covering Parker Rawlings, Anna Pendleton, and a detail that made Scott laugh out loud in a courthouse hallway, which he immediately apologized for: Idlewood Regional Medical Center, meaning the man was legally barred from the building with his name on the plaque. The state medical board suspended his license 8 weeks later on an emergency basis. The data bank report went in. 2 insurance panels dropped him. His malpractice carrier, reading the same file, declined to renew. And in that state, you cannot practice without coverage, which means the license suspension was almost beside the point. I want to name something here, because I think it's the real lesson, and everybody skips past it. Nobody in this story defeated Alexander Pendleton. Scott didn't. Catherine didn't. Detective Underwood didn't. Not one person in this file outmaneuvered him, or outlawyered him, or caught him in a trap. What happened is that a set of extremely boring institutional systems, a mandated reporter hotline, a health information exchange, a summary suspension bylaw, a skeletal survey protocol, a data bank, were finally pointed at him. All of those systems existed the entire time. All of them were sitting there, funded, staffed, and running, for the whole 26 months a 9-year-old was getting hurt. They just never got switched on, because switching them on requires one human being to look at a piece of paper and say, "This doesn't sit right." And for 26 months, every single adult who saw one piece of that puzzle was too busy, too rushed, or too impressed by the man in the good coat. The trial never happened. In February, 4 months after the arrest, Alexander Pendleton took a plea: 5 years, with a term of probation after, permanent surrender of his medical license, and a lifetime bar from unsupervised contact with minors. The reason he took it, his lawyer said this out loud at the plea hearing, which surprised everybody, is that he could not survive the skeletal survey being read aloud to a jury by Dr. Cynthia Talbert with photographs on a screen. Bones do not get impressed by anybody's coat. He did not go quietly. I want to be clear about that, because the version of this where a bad man simply falls over is not the version that happened, and the counterpunch he threw was genuinely dangerous. Alexander Pendleton hired a criminal defense attorney out of the city, and that attorney did the correct professional thing, which was to look for the weakest load-bearing element in the case against his client and pull on it. The weakest element was Scott Rawlings. The theory they built was this: an embittered ex-husband, downwardly mobile, working in the basement of the very hospital where the accused physician sat on the board, had gained improper access to a child's protected health information, coached a 9-year-old, and manufactured a referral by exploiting his personal relationships with hospital staff. Read that again, because it is a good theory. Every single element of it is arguable. Scott had motive. He had proximity. He had relationships in that building that were, by any measure, unusual. And the referral had in fact come from a friend of his at 4 in the morning. They filed it as a motion in the custody case, and they filed a parallel complaint with the hospital's compliance office, which is the part that could have ended him. Because here is the thing about working in a hospital. A credible allegation that an employee accessed a patient record without a business reason is not a slap on the wrist. It is a federal privacy matter. It is termination on the spot, pending investigation, and Idlewood Regional was legally required to run the audit. So on a Tuesday in October, Scott Rawlings was called off the floor at 11 at night, still in his apron, and walked to an office on the 2nd floor, where 2 people from compliance and 1 attorney for the hospital sat him down and told him he was suspended without pay effective immediately, pending an audit of every electronic access event associated with his employee credentials. He was out of work for 9 days with a 9-year-old in the house and $411 in his checking account. His mother, Sandra, paid his mortgage that month. Larry Oakhurst put a coffee can on the counter in the night kitchen without asking anybody's permission, and by the end of the week, there was $1,100 in it, in ones and fives, from people making $19 an hour. And then the audit came back, and it was the funniest document I have ever read in a file like this. Scott Rawlings did not have access to the electronic medical record, at all. He had never had access to it. A dish machine operator's badge opens a loading dock, a locker room, a walk-in cooler, and a time clock. His credentials had 0 encounters with a patient chart in 9 years, because there is no version of that system where the guy running the sanitizer can look at anybody's labs. The allegation was not weak. It was structurally impossible, and it took the audit team about 90 minutes to establish that, and they took 9 days to write it up, because that is how long compliance takes. But that audit did something else, and this is the twist that turned a custody fight into a felony case. Because once you run an access audit on a patient, and they had to run one on Parker Rawlings to answer the question, you get the complete list of every credential in the network that has ever opened that child's chart. And the auditors, doing their jobs, printed all of it. Between 2 years and 3 months earlier and the previous August, the chart of Parker Rawlings had been accessed 31 times by a credential with no treatment relationship to the patient. The credential belonged to Dr. Alexander Pendleton, and they weren't in Idlewood. 26 of the 31 were queries through the State Health Information Exchange, the same system Catherine Wolcott used at 4:31 in the morning, into facilities in 3 other counties: Marion, Delmar, the walk-in clinic, the Children's Hospital. He had been checking. After every single injury, within about 72 hours, Alexander Pendleton had logged in and pulled his stepson's records from whichever facility they had gone to see what had been written down, to see whether anyone had used the words, to see whether a flag had been set. He was auditing the paper trail on a child he was hurting, using a system built to protect children, on his own login, 31 times. I have thought a lot about why a man that intelligent would do something that stupid, and I think the answer is the same as the answer to why he said what he said on the phone to Scott. He did not believe the systems applied to him. He had sat on the board that approved those bylaws. He had signed off on that exchange agreement. In his head, those were tools he administered, not rules he was inside of. The prosecutor, an assistant district attorney named Henry Penhall, told Scott's attorney privately that the access log was worth more than the x-rays, because the x-rays proved a pattern of injury and the access log proved a state of mind. An innocent stepfather does not check, from a different county, whether a doctor wrote down anything worrying. The compliance complaint that was supposed to destroy Scott Rawlings is the reason Alexander Pendleton took a plea. Scott was reinstated with back pay on a Thursday. He came in on his first shift back, and the entire night crew was in the kitchen at 10 o'clock at night, which is not when most of them start, and somebody had made a sign, and it was a bad sign, and he had to go stand in the walk-in cooler for a minute. I want to back up and fill in the 5 months, because people skip over them and they are the actual spine of this. From April, when Parker flinched at the cereal, until September, when the car pulled in with the green cast, Scott Rawlings kept a spiral notebook in the door pocket of his truck, and in it he wrote dates and single lines, and he did not tell one living person he was doing it. The entries are short and terrible. April 9th, flinched, reaching for cereal, said sorry, then said sorry again. April 27th, long sleeves, 81 degrees. May 14th, asked about the lake house. He changed the subject 3 times. Wouldn't say the word Alec. June 2, bruise, left upper arm, 4 marks in a row. Said he ran into the boat trailer. Boat trailer is not 4 marks in a row. June 30th, asked me, out of nowhere, if a kid can pick who they live with. Said just wondering. July 19th, narrating again on the way back. We had a really good weekend, Dad. It was really fun. Everything was fine. Before I asked anything. August 8th, school nurse note in backpack. 3rd bathroom pass request, this week per Ms. Yardley. He doesn't want to change for gym. 22 entries over 5 months. Now, every instinct a father has says, act on entry number 1. Kick the door in. Call somebody. And I understand that completely. and so does Scott. Here is why he didn't, and he explained it to me in one sentence. If I go in there in April with a flinch and a bad feeling, I lose him. He was right, and it is worth understanding exactly why he was right, because this is the part that will actually help somebody watching. In April, what Scott had was a suspicion held by a man with an obvious motive to have it. If he had called Child Protective Services in April, an investigator with 51 open cases would have gone to a 5-bedroom house on a private road and met a well-spoken physician and a calm mother and a coached child, and would have closed it as unsubstantiated within 30 days. That closure would then have existed forever as a document, and every subsequent report would have been read against it. And Pendleton would have known he'd been reported, and he would have adjusted. Different counties, no urgent cares at all, nothing on paper anywhere. And Anna, humiliated and defensive, would have gone to court to restrict Scott's time, and a judge looking at an unsubstantiated report filed by an ex-husband would have given it to her. 5 months of a notebook is not passivity. It is a man refusing to spend his one shot early. And the notebook mattered enormously later. For a reason Scott did not anticipate, it was contemporaneous. Every entry was dated in his own hand, in ink, in a cheap notebook, and 3 of those entries, the 4 marks on the upper arm on June 2nd, the long sleeves in 81-degree weather, the gym changing, lined up with healed injuries on the skeletal survey that nobody could have known about in advance. You cannot fake that backwards. Dr. Talbert's report cites it twice. There is one more person in this story I have to tell you about, because she is the reason the 4 a.m. call worked, and because her own history is the whole argument for why you should know the people around you. Catherine Wolcott had been a nurse for 31 years, and for the first 9 of them she worked at a hospital 2 states away, and in her 2nd year there, as a very young nurse, she took care of a 4-year-old with a spiral fracture of the femur and a story about a fall from a couch. She told her charge nurse it did not sit right. Her charge nurse told her that the family were good people and that she was new. She let it go. 14 months later, that child died, and Catherine Wolcott found out about it from a newspaper, and she has carried that for 29 years, and it is why she knows the hotline number without looking it up, and why she has made 40 reports, and why, when a man in a wet apron put a piece of paper on her counter at 4 a.m, she did not say, "Let's wait and see." She put her hand flat on the desk and she started dialing. Every institution in this story worked, but the switch is always a person, and the person is almost always somebody carrying something. Scott found that out in the courthouse hallway in November, and it is the only time in this whole file that he lost his composure. The custody hearing was on a Thursday morning. Scott came in a gray suit with his mother. He expected the room to hold 4 people. There were 51. Night shift nurses off of 12 who had not gone home. 2 EMTs, a state trooper in uniform on his own time. 3 respiratory techs, Larry Oakhurst in a tie that did not fit. 2 security guards, a dispatcher named Ruth, a chaplain, a woman from environmental services whose name Scott had known for 9 years and whose son he had helped get a job in the kitchen. They filled the gallery, and then they filled the wall behind the gallery, standing, and the bailiff let them, and the judge looked up over her glasses at a room full of scrubs at 9 a.m. and asked what this was. And Catherine Wolcott stood up and said, "We're here for the dishwasher, Your Honor." There is a piece of this I have not told you yet, and it is my favorite part, and it happened in a hallway. In November, between the arrest and the plea, there was a hearing on the permanent custody order. Scott was there in a gray suit that his mother had bought him. Anna was there with her own attorney, no longer living in the house on the private road, working days at a dental office in Marion. And in the hallway outside courtroom 3, at about 10 a.m, Alexander Pendleton, out on bond, in a very good coat, not permitted to be in the courtroom, was sitting on a bench with his attorney. Scott walked past him to get a drink of water, and Pendleton looked up and did not recognize him, not for about a second and a half. Scott watched it happen, the flat, polite, mid-distance glance you give a stranger in a hallway, and then the click, and then the color leaving the man's face, because he had never once looked at him. That was the whole thing. Scott Rawlings had worked in that man's hospital for the entire time that man sat on its board. Pendleton had walked through that cafeteria 150 times. He had stood at that counter, 5 feet from a man in a wet apron, and talked about settlements and residents and money, and once, memorably, about a nurse's body. He had been served coffee by him. He had never looked at his face. He had married the man's wife, moved into a house with the man's son, and broken that son's arm, and he had never established, in 2 years, what the father actually did or who he actually knew, because a man who washes dishes was not a category of person he collected information about. If Alexander Pendleton had spent 9 minutes, one time, being curious about the guy in the basement, he would have learned that the guy in the basement had personally fed, remembered, and quietly taken care of every single person who works nights in that county for 9 years, and that includes the charge nurse in the pediatric emergency department, who has made 40 mandated reports and knows exactly which extension to dial at 4 in the morning. That is not a network anybody could have bought. It cost 9 years of 3 a.m. coffee, and it was not for sale. The final hearing was in February, and it took 11 minutes. Scott Rawlings received sole legal and physical custody of Parker. Anna Pendleton, she went back to Rawlings 4 months later, which Scott says he had no feelings about either way, receives supervised visitation twice a month at a family center in Marion, and by every account she goes to all of them and is early to all of them. Here is what I think you want to know about how it ended, and here is what actually happened, which is quieter. Scott did not sue anybody. He could have. His attorney, Patrick Loveridge, laid out a civil case against the urgent care in Delmar for what it failed to ask, and against Pendleton Nolte for a chart that a partner signed without a follow-up question, and told him honestly that it was worth a meaningful number. Scott said no. His reasoning, which he gave in one sentence in Loveridge's office, is the sentence I have thought about most in this entire file. He said, "Every one of those people is going to spend the rest of their career asking one more question, and if I sue them, the lesson turns into insurance." He did do one thing though, and it is the thing I would put on his headstone. In the spring, Scott Rawlings, a man with no medical degree, in a rubber apron, on the night shift, asked for a meeting with the quality committee of Idlewood Regional. Catherine Wolcott walked him in. He had 2 pages. What he proposed was not complicated. He proposed that any pediatric fracture presenting to that hospital, or its affiliated urgent cares, should automatically trigger a records aggregation query across the Health Information Exchange, the same one Catherine had filled out by hand at 4:31 in the morning. Not a review. Not an accusation. Just pull the other charts and put them in front of the doctor before he signs. He said, and there are minutes of this, "Nobody in my kid's story did anything wrong on purpose. They each saw 1 X-ray. Somebody just has to put the 4 X-rays on the same screen. That's it. That's the whole thing." They adopted it in July. It runs automatically now. In the first 11 months, it flagged 9 children across the network, and in 2 of those cases, the flag was the reason somebody asked a second question. 2. Scott Rawlings still washes dishes on the night shift at Idlewood Regional. He has been offered other things. He turned down a supervisor job because it was days. Parker is 11 now. He has a scar on his left forearm from the pinning they eventually had to do on the old ulnar fracture, and he tells people he got it in a bike wreck, which Scott has decided not to correct, because a boy is allowed to choose his own story about his own arm. 3 afternoons a week, Parker does his homework at a steel prep table in the basement kitchen of that hospital, because he likes it down there, and because Larry Oakhurst taught him to make a grilled cheese on the flat top, and because at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the night crew starts coming in, and every single one of them says his name. So let me tell you what I actually think this story is about, because it is not about a broken arm, and it is not about a rich man losing a license. Go back to the beginning. 4 things said out loud in front of a man holding a bus tub. There is a habit that comes with a certain amount of comfort, and it is not cruelty. It is a filter. Your brain, trying to save you effort, quietly sorts the people around you into 2 piles. People who are part of the situation, and people who are part of the room. The barista, the guy at the loading dock, the overnight cleaner, the woman restocking the cups. Your brain files them as scenery, and stops spending energy on them. And you will swear up and down that you don't do this. And you do. I do. Everyone does. The mistake is not the filing. The mistake is believing the filing is accurate. Because the man you have filed as scenery has a 9-year relationship with every person who works nights in your building. The woman restocking the cups is the one everyone tells things to. The overnight cleaner has seen who comes and goes at 2 in the morning for 6 years, and remembers all of it. These are not powerless people. They are unobserved people, which is a completely different thing. And unobserved is a form of power that the observed will never have. Alexander Pendleton did not lose because Scott Rawlings was strong. He lost because he had spent 2 years deciding that a specific human being contained no information worth acquiring, and it turned out that specific human being was standing at the exact junction of every night shift relationship in the county. He didn't underestimate him. He never estimated him at all. And the second thing, which is the practical one. Look at what Scott actually did, because it is repeatable, and it is not heroic. He did not confront. He did not go to the house. He did not post anything, threaten anybody, or make a speech. He did 4 things, in order, and any one of us could do all 4. He noticed a word that did not belong in a sentence. I promise. He wrote down dates in a spiral notebook in his truck for 5 months without acting, which is the hardest possible thing and the reason the timeline held up later. He kept the actual document instead of arguing about it. And then he took it to the one person he knew who would understand what it meant, and he said 7 words, and then, this is the crucial part. He shut up and let a professional do her job. He didn't try to be the detective. He didn't try to be the doctor. He knew exactly what he was, which is a man with a piece of paper and a good relationship, and he spent that relationship in one clean shot. Most people, in that parking lot, at 10 at night, with that phone call still in their ear, would have driven to that house. And if Scott Rawlings had driven to that house, this would be a completely different story, with a completely different ending, and the person in a cell would not be the surgeon. So here is what I want you to actually do with this, and it is 2 things, and both of them are small. The first one is for tomorrow. Sometime in the next 24 hours, you are going to be in a room with somebody your brain has filed as furniture. The guy at the counter, the crew in the hallway, the person who empties the bin in your office at 7 p.m. Ask them one real question and use their name. Not as charity. I'm not asking you to be nice. I'm telling you that you are walking past the best-informed people in every building you enter, and you have decided in advance that they know nothing. The second is for the day you need it, when a kid gives you a sentence that has a load-bearing word in it. I promise. Remember, it's fine. I already told you. Do not interrogate the kid. Take the piece of paper, whatever the piece of paper is in your situation, and put it in front of one person who will know what it means. Then get out of the way. You do not have to be powerful. You have to be adjacent to somebody who is, and you have to have earned 5 minutes of their attention, and the currency for that is not money. It is 9 years of coffee, black, 1 sugar, handed over a counter at 3 a.m. to somebody who was having the worst night of somebody else's life. I'm Nathan. Somebody in your building knows everything. Go find out their name.